Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to our Lean In event, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, The More You Know. I am Amrita Agarwal, and I'm the events team lead at the Lean In Canada's Vancouver chapter, and I'm really excited to bring this event to you so that we can all take small steps towards creating truly inclusive, diverse, and equitable communities. And thank you so much for joining us today and supporting Lean In throughout these events. We would love to see your beautiful faces during the event, so please turn on the video if you're able, and we would really love that. Thank you. All right. So thank you so much for submitting your questions in advance. The panel will try and answer all your pre-submitted questions in the first 45 minutes of the event. This will be followed by about 20 minutes of open question and answer session where you can ask any question to the panel that wasn't already addressed. All right, then, let's get started. I am so happy to introduce our esteemed panelists. Joining us for the session is Stephanie Rediwo, who is a fearless equity, diversity, and inclusion leader with over 20 years of software experience at SAP. And recently, she started working at TransLink, and she is actually TransLink's first equity, diversity, and program lead, focused on leading the development and implementation for all equity, diversity, and inclusion programs for 8,000 employees. So please welcome Stephanie. We're also joined by Tara Robertson, who is an intersectional feminist who uses data and research to advocate for equity and inclusion. She's currently working as a diversity and inclusion lead for Mozilla, and she has more than 10 years of experience making open source and tech communities more diverse and welcoming. Please welcome Tara. And lastly, we're joined by Shweta Rajan, who is a speaker consultant and an emphatic champion for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Her consultancy work at Inclusion Advantage focuses on helping companies recognize structural and systemic barriers to creating a culture of belonging. So thank you so much, all of you, for giving your time and joining us today. And without further ado, let's jump straight into the questions. All good, panelists? Okay. All right. So the first question that was submitted to us was, can you talk a little bit about what inclusion is and why we should opt for it? So I believe Tara can take the lead on this one.
Sure. It's one thing to make a company diverse, like by having people from different backgrounds join the company, but if everyone has to leave what makes them different and unique and special at the door when they come in, then it's not very inclusive. For me, inclusive is the feeling of belonging and the feeling that despite having a different background, that your voice is welcomed, valued, and respected.
Thank you so much, Tara, for your contribution. The next question that was submitted was, how do you recommend getting employees on board with employee resource groups on EDI, and how one can create sorority within a very corporate environment? So Stephanie, why don't you start us off with this one?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so I definitely think with employee resource groups, in order for you to kind of get it off the ground, I definitely think you need an executive sponsor. You know, anytime that you want to start an ERG, and sometimes they're called affinity groups or BRGs as well, just in case if you hear of those terms. Yeah, you need an executive sponsor, but you also need to know your why. Like, what's the purpose of creating this ERG? And it's not, I think sometimes there may be this feeling of like, oh, we in our organization don't have one, we should do something. And that's kind of, I would say, the wrong way to sort of think about it. I mean, I know previously at SAP, you know, they had a very strong sort of women's organization, and they felt that they really needed that. And you know what, I totally respect that and understand. I think there's also the business case too, sometimes, to think about how do we have and bring in that intersectionality, whether it is an inclusion ERG, for example, right? But each organization, it depends. I would say, besides deciding sort of why you're creating it, and I'm also I'm sort of looking at my notes if you see me looking down here, you'll definitely have to have a strong business case. And I think part of that question too was talking about being divisive and sort of making sure that you're always sort of explaining yourself. And I feel it, if you're starting in an ERG as the first place, you need to go to your leadership first, right? The leadership should be the very first place where you're discussing this. It's not like all of a sudden you start an ERG, without having a leadership, because I would also say then there's budget and resources. Let's not forget that people starting an ERG, this is typically on top of their day job, right? So what kind of things can we make sure and ensure? And if it's not like you're getting additional funding, but how can we recognize that person starting the ERG? Maybe I'll hand it over. I don't know, Shweta or Tara, if you want to sort of jump in and provide some other additional information.
Shweta, you're on mute.
Mute, right? Yeah, I figured. Thank you. Yeah, so for employee resource groups, I have, in a startup environment created that, and I completely agree with Stephanie that having the leadership on board is critical. I would also say that sometimes you already have something. Most of the times what I've noticed is you already have something organically happening in the company where you're forming groups or you're going out and doing things anyway. And so actually formalizing that structure and saying, hey, like if you're going out socially after work for drinks or whatever, and saying that you can even build a business case based on that, saying we're already, we have seen that we have improved communication and we are getting to know each other and we've had this background already. And so it would be great if we could actually get it in a formalized structure because we have seen these benefits come across. Wherever I have been successfully able to create groups, it has been because leadership has been on board. It is very challenging if you don't have it, leadership buy-in. On the other hand, sometimes with or without leadership buy-in, sometimes just having, whether it's formalized or not, having a space where people can voice their opinions and feel safe and to say whatever big concern is there on top of their mind. I think having a safe space is really, really important for companies to thrive. And, not, especially if you're in a startup environment or if you're a smaller company, not everyone has the resources money-wise to dedicate, but there's so many things. Even if you can carve out time and recognize that, okay, people who are volunteering or running these groups are actually contributing to your company culture, that itself, I mean, I can understand in this pandemic where people are tightening their budgets, money might not be the first thing that people can give, but times is, and it is as valuable. So if in your sprint planning meeting or whatever, you should have that in your process structure already, some time dedicated to running these groups, and so that it does not fall upon marginalized communities who are often people who lead these groups, that they are doing the extra work that's necessary. That's what I have to say. Tara, do you had any thoughts?
Oh,
All right. Thank you so much, Steph and Shweta, for sharing your opinion on this. I have another question your way, Stephanie. So what do you think are some elements of great EDI programs?
Well, okay, so tying or thinking about sort of the first initial steps around an ERG, again, I can't sort of say the importance of the executive sponsorship, and maybe I'll just kind of take a minute to kind of expand on that, because I think grassroots initiatives and highly engaged employees can do a lot, for sure. But there comes a point to where, it's kind of like passion and adrenaline only run so far. And if you use that passion and you get to that point where you're saying the same thing to the executives and there isn't that buy-in, it's sometimes you might need to sort of think and readjust. So I feel like having an executive on board, and it might not be your manager, and it might be in finance, or it might be in sales, or it might be in HR. Unfortunately, I do think, just to sort of state it, in tech, sometimes if you have an executive in HR, it feels like it then becomes a compliance program, like, and that might not be the case, but that's the perception, right? Oh, here comes HR, right? Whereas if you potentially have, some people from HR, but from sales, from finance, from engineering, then it sort of shows that it's like we're trying to embed this program into the entire organization. So that's executive sponsorship. Budget and resources. So when I say budget and resources, it could be a variety of things, of actual dollars or actual given time, where managers give their employees dedicated time to work on it. Because again, that passion piece works only so many hours for evenings and weekends, right? And typically I still think, I see sort of the field changing a bit, but I still think a lot of the work is done by somebody with their day job, and then they show they're interested in EDI, which means equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's sort of how and they're given that on top of their day job because they've shown a bit of passion and they're able to influence. And of course, I feel like that has to change. The stakeholder engagement piece is a big one. No use doing a program if nobody's going to use it or interested, really. It's like the best software, right? You could have the best software that nobody uses. And then I would also say there's that communication piece to make sure that if you do, and this is unfortunately, I feel like for large, small organizations, you could be doing something amazing, but if nobody knows about it, it's kind of hard to kind of build up that momentum. Right. And so that communicating and sort of sharing what you're doing and even having sort of the buy-in from marketing. And then the other piece, and this sometimes can be a bit harder when you're starting out, but like there is that measurement piece you absolutely need, because you want to be careful it just doesn't become a program to have a program. If there's no intention of really sort of measuring what it is. And so let me give an example. So I have seen sometimes within past organizations I've been in that, as women go up there, within their career, there's less women sort of, as I would say, sort of moving up the chain, moving up the ladder, however you want to say. And the research sort of shows it's that sponsorship, right? And so we created a program really focused on that. Getting the men involved, which I always sort of feel like I am tired as a woman. I don't need any more mentors, any more books. I got a ton. I need somebody to sponsor me. Like, please, no more advice, right? And I say that sort of facetiously, but you can kind of understand of like the amount of, it's probably, you can probably see there's probably half EDI books and half self-improvement, right, behind me, right? So yeah, those are some elements. Hopefully that kind of gave the audience some perspective there.
I just want to tag on because I think what I heard you say that it needs to be strategic, like being really clear about like what problem are you solving here. Someone reached out to me and said, I'd really like to do something for it's like a cultural month. So it's like Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month or something. And I was like, okay, like tell me more. What problem are you trying to solve by doing an event? And they're like, well, I just think we should celebrate culture. And I was like, cool, like if you want to do that, great, but that is not something that I'll be taking on. Like I have to make really tough decisions about what we do and what we don't do. And one of the things that we decided to do this year was focus on psychological safety, which is the belief you can speak up with like great creative ideas out of the box, or speak up when you see you have a problem. So I had a hypothesis, and this is just also where Mozilla was at. Like innovation is really important. We had layoffs in January, and we actually had layoffs last week. So there's some hard things. And as a product company, we need to be innovating. So It's like, like given our circumstances, given our business challenges, who feels safe speaking up in the meetings? Who doesn't? Like, and how can we start to build a culture where this is true? So the way I approached it, I brought in the world expert, Dr. Amy Edmondson, who teaches at Harvard Business School. She was amazing. She did an amazing keynote. And we had like the global expert in the room, and that kind of level set for everyone what we were going to be talking about. And then digging into the elements of psychological safety and how you build that, I was like, there's a lot of interpersonal communication and communication on teams. How are we going to build those skills? So we were working with an L&D learning and development vendor called Life Labs. They do really great interactive workshops. So we did one on feedback skills, because if you've got feedback to give, whether it's positive or negative, like we can all improve and make a better culture of innovation if we can do that well. So there was a couple other pieces of that program, but then the measurement piece was I looked at the employee engagement survey and at the innovation factor, which my hypothesis was that these interventions would help build psychological safety and help build an environment where innovation could more readily take place. And the people who participated in the pilot were more than 10% higher on that factor. So to me, that suggests we're going in the right way. It's not completely scientific, like there's some other things in there, but being able to measure and go, yeah, there's something to this pilot, let's go deeper.
Thank you so much, Tara and Stephanie, for your great insights on this really important topic. So we'll move on to the next question. So the next question was, for those of us promoting a diverse and inclusive practice, do you have any tips for engaging with stakeholders and handling possible backlash? I believe Shweta can take this one.
Could you repeat that question again?
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So the question was, for those of us promoting a diverse and inclusive practice, do you have any tips for engaging with stakeholders and handling possible backlash?
Thank you. So this is a really great question. I loved that someone was thinking about that. So as we've talked about, Stephanie's mentioned this before, and Tara's mentioned it before as well. What we do want to say is, like, we always have to start with leadership buy-in. When you talk about stakeholder engagement, if you don't have leadership buy-in and have really strong, you start there. Why do you want to do this? So, and that's like really, and is it embedded, like why do you want to do it? And is it embedded in your organization's vision or mission? Like, where is it tying in there, and having that conversation first. So when you have the leadership buy-in, and then going on to the communication piece, ongoing to communicating with your stakeholders, saying, okay, we've taken this step. This is how we see that it ties in with our organization. This is why we believe that we are taking these steps, and then communicating that ongoingly. And as far as how do you deal with the backlash, that's why I said, you start with why, because if you're clear on why you're doing it, dealing with the backlash becomes easy, because now you've taken a stand. And you do have to take a stand, because at some point you have to say that this is valuable to me. I see the value of this. Now, depending on who you are and what you value, it might be the financial benefit that you're valuing, the long-term benefits in having a great organization culture that you're valuing, or it can be whatever you choose to, a better equitable society, whatever you choose to place your value in. But that becomes, once you know what your values are and why you're taking this project on, the backlash is easy to deal with. For example, one of the really great example is Colin Kaepernick and Nike. He took a kneel down and faced massive amount of backlash from NFL, and he got kicked from his team. He was basically not allowed to participate. Majority of the sponsors pulled out. Nike took a stand and said, no, we are going to this is what we believe in, this is what we choose to, we take stand with Colin. And then they actually, they didn't know how it was going to play out. It eventually paid out in people getting in, actually having more brand engagement. But you have to draw a line in the sand, and that comes if you have a very clear vision and understanding of why you're doing it in the first place. So start with leadership engagement, have a very clear understanding of why you're taking such programs on, and then be willing to take the stand and draw the line in the sand if you have to. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Shweta, for your input on this question. So the next question that we have is, how do organizations measure progress and the benefits of a more inclusive workplace over time beyond simply hiring and retention data? I believe, Tara, that's your expertise.
Yeah, I'd love to take this on. Like, I'm really nerdy about the numbers and being able to measure impact, to measure change. And especially in an engineering organization, we measure things we care about. And I think if you're not measuring things, to me, it's lip service. So we need to know, when we say we want to make our workplace more diverse, you kind of need to know where the baseline is. Like, who works here right now? And that may not be an easy question to answer. I know, like, I see some people here from the education sector, and I know there's some issues with like getting data there. I think there's, from industry to industry, there's different limitations, or yeah, it's just different. But if this is something that matters, we need to be able to track it and measure it. And like, we measure budgets, we measure progress towards KPIs, like we need to be able to measure this. The diversity piece is a bit simpler because it's people measurement, and ideally that's in your HRIS system. But the inclusion piece is a little harder to measure. I love, like, we've used Culture Amp at Mozilla for a long time for our employee engagement survey. And what I love about it is that they have a heat map functionality. So I'm able to see what the sentiment is between different groups. And I'm not really worried about the overall score. Like, it's sort of useful, but I want to know what the difference is between the majority and minority group. So for example, like, what are women's sentiment compared to men's? Or what do non-binary staff feel compared to women and men? And those gaps there are what I'm really interested in. And it doesn't tell me why there's a problem, but it sure highlights some areas that we need to focus on. An example of this is early on, one of the big gaps we were seeing at Mozilla was around the question, I feel safe to report harassment, bullying, and other unwanted behavior. And that gap was really concerning for me, because like, if you think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you don't even feel safe, like, you're not going to be doing your best work. So we needed to figure out what was going on there. So like, dug into it, did some focus groups with people, found out what the problem was, worked with different parts of HR to kind of flow chart what would happen if people reported this in this country or this incident in this scenario, just to get alignment and to be like, well, what would happen? Because it is quite complicated depending on what jurisdiction you're in. And over time, like, by doing that, getting alignment, as well as communicating the different ways that people could report this stuff, we were able to close the gap. And that's something I'm really proud of. And it's really foundational, I think, to becoming a more inclusive culture. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. We've done external diversity disclosures for 3 years now, which is where we report out to the world at a high level what our numbers are. And it's kind of like, without the context, it's a lot of numbers. So I worked with a graphic facilitator to kind of tell the story visually. And I know that there's someone here that does that work, so you may find that of interest. It helped really kind of tell the story. And even though the intended audience was outside the company, inside the company, people were able to understand the information better and kind of be advocates as well.
Thank you so much, Shara, for your
if I can just tag on this question, sometimes like it's great if, you're big enough organization that you can afford to do these things. But in Vancouver, especially, or actually in Canada, 80% of our organizations are 20 people or less, or 50 people or less. So we have a lot of small organizations who might still be interested in this and might not have, the capabilities of taking on something as intensive as Culture Amp. Culture Amp is amazing. I've looked at, I haven't personally worked at it, but I've looked at what they offer, and it's a great tool. But in the organizations that I've worked for, we never had the financial capacity to take that on. However, there are other ways that you can very easily see whether someone is, like, whether people are being included or not. If in a meeting you're sitting around and you constantly notice it's a 20 people meeting and 4 people are speaking up over and over again, you got a problem there. If there are all hands meeting or company updates and no one is asking any questions, they are just sitting and listening to you speak about finances and your vision for the whole hour, and there is no engagement, that tells you there is a problem. So there are a lot like that people are not comfortable asking questions or speaking up. So I think, like, when you're talking about inclusion, there are like very strong cues that you get. And if you're trying to constantly, if in any organization at any point of time, everyone always looks at the senior person to be speaking all the time, that's a problem. You want the junior members to be able to speak up first and have their ideas put on board before they look at senior people, and they can have because if a senior person speaks up, the junior person, whoever feels junior, it's a lot from a psychological safety perspective. It takes a lot for them to say, I actually disagree with this point of view. So there are so many different cues that you can have as a small organization if you are being mindful and looking for things as a leader or as a manager in your company or in your teams, without necessarily, if you are 50 people, you might or might not want to take on, software or surveys, things like that, because of 50 people, you can't even do a survey properly. But there are ways that you can figure out whether everyone is feeling valued, and has, feels safe enough to speak up in organizations. So
thank you for that perspective. Like, I think that you're reminding, like, it's good for me as well to hear the number of Canadian companies with 20 people or less is like 80%. And I love that you've got like these low tech free observation techniques to use to measure these things. Thanks for that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Shweta and Tara, both of you, for your input on this very important question. So the next one is again for you, Tara, and we want to know, how do you bring the topic of EDI up to the leadership team?
So when I started 3 years ago, there was an accountability framework that we got buy-in from our CEO and we call them our steering committee, so our chief, like most senior executives, and they put measurable accountability goals on the table. So they tied some diversity and inclusion goals to their executive bonuses, which I think is a really strong way to have accountability. Like, it's good to set goals, it's good to say we care, but like, where does the buck stop? And once that was in place, I had monthly coaching meetings with each executive to be like, here's where you're at, here's what I see, what are you seeing, where are you challenged with? And it took some time to build trust, but there was like, they were totally on board, and it was sometimes having hard conversations, sometimes being a thought partner, sometimes encouraging them to do the tough thing, but those partnerships were really key, I think.
Thank you, Tara. And Shweta, I believe you have some input on this as well.
Yeah, and it's very similar. When I started, my interest kind of, I've worked in smaller organizations. I've taken this on within organizations because it has always been something that I've been very personally interested in. And so, but at some point when, there came a point where I was managing this employee resource group, leading it, and then I saw all these ideas come up, and I was like, well, there's no point if we're just talking between ourselves. Like, we need to be able to implement it. And so, someone has to step up and have those brave conversations with the leadership team for you to be able to change it from a space where you're sharing things to actually getting it to the policy and implementation level. So, you need to have that person, whoever it is. It happened to be me in most in some cases, but you do need to go and have those conversations and be like, hey, this is what I'm hearing, this is what's going on, this will be useful for this organization, how can we make this work, right? And having those conversations is key. And as I've said, the most success you see is where you have more buy-in from the leadership team. So whatever it takes, and speaking to the leadership team, everyone they don't have the capacity necessarily to be focusing on things. So you need to be able to build your case strategically. So having a clear-cut pitch that you can make to them, and understand what is important is good to have that mindset before you walk into that meeting with your founder or your leader. So yeah.
Can I just add in just a quick comment, just to kind of, for everybody here, in my experience, having executives tie a goal in their bonus is extremely rare. So the fact that Tara was able to do it at Mozilla is pretty exceptional. So just kind of just to reiterate how we know that's a best practice and it's easy to say that, but not a lot of executives are putting up their hand to say, oh no, I don't need that 10 grand or 20 grand if I don't hit my number, or who even knows how much they're making as a bonus. It's probably way more. So just know that if you can get to that place, there's full buy-in. So not to reiterate, but I just wanted to kind of share, just to give the context. Thanks.
Yeah, it is a, I agree, Steph. It's there are incredible places who are doing this work, and those places are incredible because they are doing this work in the sense that it's not the norm right now. So whoever is facing resistance, here, it's good to acknowledge that this is not the norm everywhere, and you probably, you're not alone if you're facing resistance. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for jumping in and sharing your own experiences with this as well. So the next question is, what do you think is the impact of working from home on diversity and inclusion? And I guess, Stephanie, that's for you.
Okay, this question, I feel like I could take the next 25, 30 minutes because I have, this question has so many angles to it, really. So I'm gonna speak about it from a gender perspective, shall we say, in the sort of the traditional male female, because and sort of spatter in a few other things, because what I have seen, and even today as I'm looking down, I think there was a CNBC article that came out that basically said 33% of millennial mothers who were unemployed in July reported that it was because of access to childcare or needed to take care of kids who weren't in school, compared to, can anybody guess, of millennial fathers what that number was? So 33% for the mothers, and any guesses? Throw in a number. 5% to 10. Yeah, 11%. Right. That I'm sure for those parents on the phone here, I'm sure that's not a surprise. And I should also say, it's not just sort of for parents of kids and whether at different ages, but like if you have parents, aging parents, sick parents, this is an extra burden in the sense that your days are longer. I mean, from a personal experience, the shift from work to, you know, to end of the day to home life, it just goes, right? It starts at 7 and goes on until 10. If my family heard me, they'd say, no, Steph, you go to bed at 9:30. But anyways, 9:30, right? I would also say, you know, another study called it, or another article from the RBC Economics called it the she session. And that 1.5 million women in Canada lost their job in the first 2 months of the pandemic.
Mhm.
And that is a huge problem, to not have them back at work. And so I definitely, and unfortunately, I would say in BC and in Canada, especially with what we're dealing with for those parents with back to school, you know, who knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, I have a daughter in high school, and I'm really hoping with all of the safety measures there, you know, that nobody gets sick. But the reality is someone will, just based on the numbers, right? When you do
Mhm.
the math, right? So what does that mean? So yeah, I would say there's a huge, I would say, potential negative impact. But then, you know, on the other side is there is these little glimmers, and I'm not sure of others how they feel on the call, but of, you know what, we spend more time talking about things as a family. You know, we take the dog out. We don't have to run to activities, right? The pressure of being like, oh, I need to go somewhere or be somewhere right now at this time, you know? And so, yeah, there's both sides to this. So that's kind of my, you know what, it's only 5 minutes or so, my discussion on this. So I could go on and talk to everybody a lot about it, but anyone else wants to sort of jump in and add a point that I may have missed?
Um, I will take on, this is great. I mean, I could talk about the whole gender thing too, but that's, to start with, there's this number that, you know, our rates right now of women employment is what we was there 3 decades ago, 30 years ago. So we've lost a lot of women in this recession. And, you know, what I want to speak to, though, since you've already mentioned most of taking the gender one, very, very, you know, empathically, Stephanie, is that the piece about some really small implementations that you can do in your organizations when you're having all these meetings virtually. One of the things is you might see that I have a fake background behind me. And that is this, you know, this green background virtual. So when you're having Zoom meetings, having a background like this allows people who might or might not have the greatest living conditions to be able, like, you know, who don't have a wonderful space that they can go to, how to have a different room that they can go to be able to join these meetings that many people are. So having something like a virtual background, also having something like making sure, as Amrita mentioned at the beginning of this call, to not mandate joining via video and just having phone conversations, allowing people to participate in meetings based on that is helpful. Making sure that you're, you know, taking into account that you have introverts in these organizations. So all your virtual happy hours that you guys are posting, making sure that you're not like, you know, that again doesn't become mandatory, or thinking about how can you implement, you know, programs where introverts can connect as well. One of the very good ones that I have seen is having random one-on-one calls with your employees, so or managers, and you just have one call a week at your leisure, and that's a way that introverts can engage in without feeling pressured to attend these social virtual meetings that they might or might not feel comfortable with. So these are some of the things just to keep in mind, because we all have gone virtual a lot. So making sure that you are being mindful that not everyone might have even high-speed internet. Like I'm in Courtney right now, and I have a bandwidth problem majority of the time. So, so there has been, you know, are you making sure that you're keeping in mind accessibility of your people, what their requirements might be, and things like that is a good way to make sure that you are implementing EDI measurements, or you have an EDI mindset while you're, you know, operating in this post-pandemic virtual world.
And I just want to sneak in as well. So like you can see, I've changed locations in my place. You may, oh, and you may hear some tools in the back. That's because our stove died and the gas repair guy's here to install the new stove. And that's what it is. We are working from home in a pandemic. Our CEO and senior leaders right from the beginning were like, hey, like this idea, like I read some tweets like where it's like, be professional. It's like this, like we're in weird times. Like let's have some space and grace for each other. And kids are gonna walk through. I think you saw my wife walk by. My dog's real cute. You're gonna hear some stuff now. And I'm just gonna share in the chat, our first company-wide meeting, there was 900 people on Zoom. Our CEO invited, you know, bring your kids, bring your pets. And the first 10 minutes were kids going, oh, I see a dog. And then one guy flipped his laptop around and walked down the hall to wake up his nocturnal hedgehog because some kid wanted to see it. Like it was messy and beautiful and like really reminded me that we are humans at work and we need to remember our humanity.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for contributing and keeping it really real, especially during this pandemic and how difficult it has been for all of us to sort of get on board with this new reality. So we'll jump to the next question, which is with regards to the topic of course, EDI. Can you speak specifically to strategies for using decolonizing language and practices? Tara, would you like to take this one?
Sure. So this week I had the pleasure of hosting Dr. Dory Tunstall, who's the Dean of Design at OCAD University in Toronto. She had an op-ed in the Globe and Mail on Saturday about for Black people to bring their full selves to work. And an interview with her was in FastCo today, talking about just the amazing work she does. She is the first Black dean and the first Black female dean of any design department anywhere. And she set up her talk by talking about the relationship to land and presented a triangle with colonizers, Indigenous people, and enslaved people. And those three categories of people all have very different relationships to the land. And I think especially in Canada doing EDI work, we really need to understand and get in good relation with First Nations at an individual level, at a community level, at a corporate level, at a university level. And that's going to look really different for all of us. I'm going to drop in the characteristics of white supremacist culture. And some of those, Dory talked about them, and Dr. Robin DiAngelo talks about them in her book, White Fragility, about perfect language and about never getting it wrong. And I think there's a balance between being brave and engaging in new ways, knowing that you'll make a mistake, and holding accountability and holding yourself to learn more, while being respectful. Like you can't be like, I don't know anything. But around decolonizing, I think we all have a lot of work to learn about Canada's colonial history, about the lands that we're on and the people who live here and their histories, and commit to a different future together. So I'll drop the links for Dory. She's amazing. And for me, she's a possibility model about what organizational and institutional change can look like here.
Thank you so much. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Stephanie.
I will send you the link later. I'm working from my phone and I can't really participate actively in chats right now, but I believe the University of Alberta has actually has a free course now that they're offering around Indigenous history, and that is something that I look forward to participating in and understanding a little bit more as a settler here and new to this country. And this is something for me to be mindful of. And then the other thing I want to say is, and if you have people in your organizations, listen to them, right? Like start there. Very recently, the president of Technical Safety BC chose to drop chief from her title as like chief executive officer because she heard from members of the organization that it has the language is triggering for some people. So if you're open, you can make the changes, and some of the changes can come from things that you don't even understand, like you won't even think about them. So listening to the people and having open conversations is really key.
I've got I guess a different point of view on that person dropping chief from their title. For me, it's performative allyship. When I looked at the executive team of her organization, there are no Indigenous people there. I looked at the board, there's only one First Nations person there. I searched their website for Indigenous and First Nations, and even with the word reconciliation, and the organization's not doing anything substantive. So the title chief executive officer, I don't have strong feelings either way, but if that's where their commitment starts and ends, it's pretty weak.
Yeah, I agree. From my understanding, it was she heard from someone in her organization and chose to take action on it. And it, like, from the way I look at it, we are all learning, trying to learn really, really quickly about things that many of us have not thought about before. And I really, if it ends there, I agree with you, Tara. That's not great, but at the starting point, listening, I feel, is and implementing, even taking whatever step you're taking, is great as a place to start, not to end, for sure.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Tara, can I get you to explain performative allyship for those that may not know? Sorry if you.
Yeah.
Please.
I don't have a succinct definition, but I think it's doing surface things that are good things to do, without a deep knowledge and commitment to change. And I think a lot of that happens around language, like how we use language and how we're afraid to use language incorrectly. So then we sometimes get stuck in this frozen state where we don't do anything at all, or we point fingers at each other and maybe just like I did, saying, dropping chief from your title, that's not meaningful. Like, that's cool, but I want to see what they're doing to hire Indigenous people or build their hiring pipeline, or to work as they do like business procurement. What's their commitment there? Show me the money.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for calling that jargon out.
Well, there's so many terms all the time that even as practitioners we're learning, so I just wanted to make sure. Thanks so much, Tara. Over to you, Amrita.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your opinions, and thank you, Tara, for giving us a lesson on performative allyship. So the next question is, what role does the HR department play in making the company more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? And how does the background of the HR team itself play into this? Stephanie, would you like to take this one?
Sure. I definitely think as we think over the years, the role of HR has really, changed from the perspective of the, just sort of policies and practices, like a compliance, do this training, do that, don't do that, to real thought leadership. And I think HR has a very big role to play. I think sometimes they get bogged down in the day-to-day things, for sure, absolutely. I think HR can really sort of set the tone when we talk about like, let's look at recruiting. You know, I have a big issue with the statement, oh, we just can't find those people, or that person doesn't apply. As I say, sort of with this mocking voice, nobody said it with that tone, but like I'm saying it. But what makes me sort of stop and think, it's like, okay, well, you know, it's like I sort of pose questions back to start, where are you putting out your job descriptions? And even let's start with your job description. How inclusive is your job description? You know, I think, Tara, I saw something on Twitter last week or so. You were talking about looking for jobs, and it's like, you know, when you ask for 20, 30 years for a new skill that's maybe only been around for 5 years, like, that's ridiculous. So, I mean, HR has the role of the job description. HR has the role of where are you making sure to put and sort of disperse your roles. If anybody's aware of the Accessible Employers website, or if you've heard of the President's Group, which is there's 25 companies within BC focused on accessible hiring. I'll put it in the link or in the chat after. They've got some great resources to sort of think about ways around accessibility and whatnot. And so different organizations you could be sending the roles to. And then, you know, let's talk about the, you know, succession planning. How is that done? Is it sort of like, oh my gosh, we need to decide today or by tomorrow, and it's not a sort of a thorough, clear criteria, right? Like, what, you know, I honestly do feel nobody, like, we should all know how we move up in an organization. And like, that's just sort of a basic question. If you don't know how you move up in an organization, you need to ask your manager, or you need to be asking people to figure that out. Because I also joke and say, the only surprise I want is on my birthday. Other than that, in my job, I don't want surprises, right? I don't want EDI to be a reactive. I want us to be proactive, you know? Yeah, so I think those are sort of a few sort of processes in how I think HR can sort of help to support. Not sure if anybody else wants to jump in.
So was the question specific around hiring, Amrita?
Yeah, so sort of the role the HR department plays in EDI initiatives.
Okay, yeah. So I think, yes, hiring and succession planning is great, but I think what we do have to be careful of is making sure that an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan is not, it's not HR. Like, it's not, HR is not the one who's driving these plans, and that it's being, I've always said that you cannot have equity, diversity, and inclusion unless you have every single person engaged and involved in your company, and you have, you know, and that happens if you have leadership. And we keep saying this over and over again, but like, I think that's where it becomes like, HR is great at trying to figure out what plans to implement, what are the how to implement them, like holding people accountable, having like a coaching practice, like a coaching mindset in your organization, I think is great. So these are the things, some of the things that HR can do. But HR as a driver of EDI, or as the only people who are interested in implementing EDI or holding training sessions or weekend workshops, this is how we have seen that over the past decades of companies trying to implement, this is when it fails. If HR is the only one who's involved in this, that's when it fails, because equity, diversity, and inclusion is everyone's business. So just want to emphasize that.
Thank you so much, Shweta, for your input, and Stephanie for yours as well. So the next question is, what is the most impactful change a company can make towards being more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? Shweta, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, when this question came up, it kind of made me smile a little bit, and I wish there was like an easy answer to this one, and one silver bullet that I could just say, do this. I would say this is a time of tremendous change, and change can happen. When the Me Too movement started a few years ago, we didn't know where it was going to go, but we have seen that women's participation in their workforce and within corporate leadership, within moving up the ladder, taking CEO positions, having board positions, all of that kind of there was like a really big push in understanding what women were going through, and we are kind of in a similar space right now. A lot of the conversation that has been started with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has surfaced recently, is creating dialogue about what is creating dialogues and helping organizations delve even deeper into bringing that equity lens, which has been missing for a long time. And I do want to emphasize that the movement started now, but people have been speaking up again about these issues for a really long time. So what I would say for people who are looking is to get started. Tara just mentioned psychological safety. That is where I strongly feel that the first thing that you should do too is focus on that. And like I said, there are very simple things that you can do to see whether people are feeling safe enough to speak up. And that's a really great starting point. But I think just getting started is important, like not being fearful of doing the wrong thing, like even because it's a learning, it's like you have to have a very growth mindset and a very humble approach when you're getting started in here or trying to further yourself wherever you're at as an organization. So having a growth mindset, learning mindset, and a very humble way of being, knowing for sure that you're going to make mistakes, you are going to make mistakes, but overcoming that, being comfortable with the uncomfortable and pushing yourself beyond that and getting started is the first step that you can take. And it's really, I think getting started is key wherever you're at, and then problem solving from there on.
Thank you, Shweta, for sharing that. In the interest of time, we'll just quickly go over the last question and then open the floor to more questions from the audience. So the last question that was submitted was, many underrepresented groups are seeking equity and opportunity, and rightfully so. Without looking at targets and projections, how is representation advanced without the perception risk that some groups are being prioritized over others? Stephanie, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So if I'm understanding this question, okay, so it's the how can we do it without the backlash potentially? And I remember maybe I'm so practical about this, and the reality is I've realized you may have backlash. It doesn't matter, right? That's just, sorry. If you're wanting to do this work, be ready to say, we don't have a problem here. We have an East Indian person. I've got a white person. We have this type of person. We've got that type of person. So we're all good, So I think it really comes down to, though, it's the communication for sure, that you need to be communicating why we're doing what we're doing and what kind of program. Again, sort of what is that sort of initial problem you're trying to solve? So I would say, I know we're going to hear from Tara and Shweta. So I'll sort of make that one statement of know what you're trying to solve and communicate it constantly and consistently. So much so that you're very tired of it, but still people will be like, why are we doing this again? Or what? So you'll have to continuously sort of reiterate the message. Maybe I'll hand it over to Tara.
Yeah, this is something I shared in our prep call. It isn't about all groups being treated the same. Like that's not the point. And I think there's at a certain point where an organization is like, you know what, this is something that is part of our core values and we're going to prioritize it. And at Mozilla, I would call this our no assholes moment, where I think historically there was a belief that if you were technically brilliant and a fantastic engineer that could, you know, do these amazing technical things, any kind of behavior was okay. And then there was a turning point where we're like, well, some specific leaders were like, hey, you know what? No assholes. Doesn't matter how technically amazing you are. Our collective culture, and again, that if you're shutting down people and we're losing out on their great ideas, or they don't feel safe to speak up when they see a clear problem happening, that is actually more important than one person's technical brilliance. So again, I think it comes back to leadership and core values. Sweta, should I pass on?
Yeah, again, like, so perception bias is like, where are you, again, are you communicating? Do you understand what the problem is? Do you understand why the programs are being implemented? Have you communicated that clearly? Have you, if you do it, you know, you follow it, you have your leadership buy-in, you have your communication, you have your stakeholder engagement. If you're doing all these things, then if you still have a perception bias at the end of it, then it's the accountability piece and making sure that you are, with the leadership team, you are ready to draw your line in the sand. There are amazing tools to make sure that people understand what equity means, like what the definition of equity means, and that there is this feeling that if you live in a meritocracy, like this is one of the biggest things, like if you're living in a meritocracy society, then assumption is everyone has the same starting point, so everyone can, as long as you give, everyone has the equal capability of moving up. But the reality of our world is that we are not starting at the same starting point. So if you have a finish line, you have different people actually starting at different points. So you do need to be able, that all the policies are there, or the programs are there, to make sure that the starting points are the same for people. And having that understanding through various, you know, programs is one of the things that I would strongly encourage, that because that is the biggest thing that is missed. And there's this idea of, you know, if as a dominant group, people actually have a different starting point, they have a different experience of life, and that is not true for everyone else in the world. And most programs are there to actually make things fairer. And so there should, that's where the programs come in. And if the leadership understands that, and there is, like, you know, stakeholder buy-in, then at some point you just have to be ready to stand your ground.
Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your thoughts on all of these questions. Let's open the floor up to more questions from the audience, and you can just type in the chat if you'd like, or just start speaking. We might only be able to do 2 questions given the time.
I think Tanis has a question. Do you want to unmute and voice it?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, my question is one that I actually submitted with the registration, but I've been thinking about whether, you know, whether we need to be more explicit about language, like anti-racism, instead of hiding behind what I think is a more gentler term like diversity. Because I think there's probably an argument that DEI or EDI makes, you know, who does that make feel safe? And I think it makes white people feel safe without really addressing the underlying problem of racism. And, you know, that's something that has been pointed out, that in Canada, we are notoriously bad at talking about racism. And so I wonder, you know, given where we're at, you know, in this point in time with TRC and BLM, and if we've been paying attention to that, whether, you know, it's time to be a little bit, to push on that term as well, and just be more explicit about it, about what it is.
I'm going to jump in because I'm so excited. Yes. And what you were saying, like in the language you were using, really reminded me of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's work about how to be an anti-racist. And his point of view is that you're either anti-racist or you're racist. Like the idea that we're neutral doesn't really exist. He's a fantastic speaker and has a really cool series coming up. It might even be this week with the NBA and WNBA. Him in discussion with some other really amazing authors.
I think it's tonight. Actually, sorry to interrupt you, Tara.
It's over 5 days. Like there's different ones.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
And the design of the event is beautiful as well, because each night it's a $50 US ticket, so it's not cheap, but you also get a book and you get to pick your book, and the book is supplied and sent out by a different Black-owned bookstore. Highly recommend his work. And yeah, I think you're making a really good point. I would totally +1 what you're saying, Tanis. Like we need, like, if not now, when are we going to be bolder? We need to be clear about our intentions. And for me, using words like anti-racism and anti-racist are really important.
I'll quickly jump in and say yes. Yes, yes, yes. And one thing as Tanis, I don't know if you're white or not, or you, but as a white person, I will say, yeah, there's lots to unpack and you have to do it. And full disclosure with regards to definitely when we saw George Floyd's death and the trauma, it really, made me think I need to up my game as a practitioner and really learn and unlearn, and really sort of made that, a very dedicated commitment. And one of the things that I swore I would do, and I probably should have been doing a long time, is to buy from Black-owned businesses. So I just did my research, and that's what I do. So.
Thank you, Stephanie. Is there any other question from the audience? We can take maybe one.
Yeah, I have a question. I want to first say thank you, ladies. This was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate it. I have recently joined BC Nurses Union, and everywhere I go, I kind of disrupt the water. And so what happened was at a staff meeting, my first one, I was a month in, BLM movement was moving quickly. And obviously COVID. And I had posted in the chat earlier that I have 3 young kids, so my sanity was also on the brink, maybe. But I asked a really hard question, and it was pretty much, what are you doing? What have you done? And then there was no response, which was very disappointing. And then the responses came afterwards in email from those who have been trying to vocalize their voices who are of the minority groups. And you can't tell from my picture, I refer to myself as white passing. I'm half Filipino, half Irish, legit parents from the origins, but I grew up in a mixed household. So I grew up with a lot of Asian influences. And so I have a voice that I know I can use and advocate for those groups who vocalized to me after only being there for a month, that they haven't been able to move the needle. In the 14 years that some people have been working there, they haven't been able to move the needle. And I'm like, well, I'm here to help you move the needle. And so I literally reached out to Paradigm. And this is to your point, Tara, about building a baseline and really understanding what the organization is. So I reached out to Paradigm to find that baseline, because I've started work in my house. I haven't ever been into the office, so I actually have not met anybody. I don't know, but what I saw was a sea of white faces, and I was like, where are all the other people? So I was kind of disheartened. I only knew that there was other ethnic groups at the organization because they emailed me. I was like, I only see white people from the New Scotland, which is Nova Scotia. I was like, yeah, all white. And I say that in conversations regularly, and a lot of the white people just silent themselves because they're uncomfortable with me saying white people. And I'm like, am I supposed to be uncomfortable? So my question, I know this is a roundabout way, is when you're building that baseline and building that foundation, this organization doesn't have any of the things that other organizations has because it is a union-based environment and there's so much politics. How do you navigate those politics? And I think this is more for Sweta, because it sounds like you have dealt with these types of organizations, not like the big tech organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so thank you. I haven't worked with any union-based organizations. Let me be just clear on that. And that is a very different ball game. Actually, Stephanie at Translink might be able to be helpful. But again, you know, find your champion in the leadership team. Like, just find one. Start there. Like, just, I learned the hard way from in one of the organizations I was working for. I wanted to implement all these programs, and I had buy-in from the minority groups or the underrepresented communities, from the staff in general, but none from the management, or very limited from the management. And that's like a death knell. So you can't progress, like however hard you try, you can't actually progress in that kind of environment. So find, like, start to have conversations with the leadership team to see who your champion is. And again, it's about having conversation, like what matters. Like it's such a time thing. People are like, oh, I don't have time for this, I have so much on my plate. So like, what is important to them? Why, how is a program like this going to make their lives useful? Are they, you know, if from a community kind of perspective, if it's BC Nurses or organization, then, you know, is your what community impact can you speak to? You know, for example, is someone from Surrey, if you understand their problems better, are you going to be able to better understand or better provide care? So things like that, like very, very on the ground experience about how is this going to be useful? Why is this important? And how is this going to be useful? In a union-based organization, like, you know, it might not be useful from an employee, like employee retention is not something that they care about very much because employees don't quit, you know? So as often. So what are some of the other things, like retention goals, where most tech organizations have? That is not a measure, it's probably not going to be useful to you, but what are the other things that you can build in and actually build a business case because for these kind of thing, and find your champion. That's about the best that I can offer. Hopefully that was useful.
Yeah, totally. And I appreciate that. And I'm very, very lucky that the COO is our champion.
Yeah.
So, and she's half Métis, which is also a benefit for the business case. I'm also a project manager, so building business cases is kind of my bread and butter. It's just now we need to determine a focused why, I think, because they don't have anything right now. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
And then, like, really, you know, what, like in a broad organization, it's like stakeholder engagement is going to be the key, right? Like different people have different like different motivations for doing something. And so, and, you know, how can you drive the importance of this enough that the burden on time, if you will, and I know nurses are nurses, managers are exceedingly busy. So how can you make that important enough for them? So it's something that's great to have a perspective on as well.
I was just going to jump in, and yeah, so at TransLink, they've got multiple unions. So I've only been there a month. So maybe, Rochelle, you should reach out to me and we can see, you know, as things continue, for sure. You know, would love to kind of share.
Thank you so much. and I think we'll end it here now. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank the three fearless ladies who joined us tonight. Thank you so much, Stephanie, Tara, and Shweta, for your insights as well as your time. I'm sure many of us feel more empowered to take the equity, diversity, and inclusion conversation further within our own communities and workplaces. And I'd also like to thank you all for joining us and giving Lean In your time and energy. A recording of today's event, along with some additional resources, will be shared with you all. So please continue to support us and join us next week for our event on resilience and mental health. And thank you again so much. And please have a wonderful evening. Thank you. See you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.